All right. Hello, everybody. This is Volts for October 29th, 2025. The escalating battle over renewable energy certificates, or RECs. I'm your host, David Roberts. You've probably seen it a million times. A business claiming to be run on 100% clean energy. What does that mean exactly? How difficult is it to achieve? Back in September, I put out a podcast on the ongoing controversy over the standards that govern voluntary corporate procurement of clean energy, wherein businesses buy renewable energy certificates, or RECs, and are subsequently allowed to claim to have offset their dirty energy use. I realize this topic sounds somewhat obscure and wonky, perhaps too obscure and wonky for two pods, but I promise it is extremely important. Big corporate energy buyers make up a substantial portion of the total market for clean energy in the U.S., and given the complete collapse of federal support, their role is going to be even more significant going forward. In brief, the International Greenhouse Gas Protocol, a set of rules and standards that governs the measurement and reporting of greenhouse gases worldwide, is being updated for the first time in 10 years, and corporate procurement standards fall under that rubric. It is widely agreed that current standards are too lax. Lots and lots of companies are claiming to run on 100% clean energy, even though the RECs they buy have little effect on emissions or on the overall energy mix. The solution is for the standards to get more granular, to require the companies that want to claim they run on clean energy to procure not just any clean energy, but clean energy that is produced at the hour when and on the same grid where they are consuming energy. In September's pod, I talked with some folks who are worried that too much granularity too quickly could stifle this market. Today, I'm speaking with people who take the opposite perspective. They believe that greater granularity will make corporate procurement more transparent, honest, and impactful. Wilson Ricks is a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton and a member of the technical working group updating these rules in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and a previous Volts guest. Killian Daly, also a member of that working group, is the Executive Director of EnergyTag, a nonprofit focused on carbon accounting. We're going to discuss what's happening with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the merits and risks of greater granularity, and the future of corporate clean energy procurement. With no further ado, Wilson Ricks, Killian Daly, welcome to Volts. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, Dave. Thanks for having us.
Guys, there's a lot here, but let's just start. Just remind us where we are in all this. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is being updated. The corporate energy part, that the scope was called Scope 2, your sort of electricity consumption emissions. The Scope 2 accounting is being updated as part of that larger Greenhouse Gas Protocol. I believe the Scope 2 working group has put out basically a discussion draft of this proposed update. Is that where we are? And then what comes next?
Basically, just to kind of take a step back, Scope 2 is about how companies account for the electricity supplied to them. There's two methodologies for doing that. There's a kind of a location-based method, which takes the grid average, or else you look at the contracts you have. So before EnergyTag, I used to do this as a practitioner. So I used to do Scope 2 for a French company called Air Liquide, which consumes more electricity than Ireland. So I've kind of done this at a pretty big scale. I've bought power at a very big scale. Essentially, when I was going and buying electricity, that was one thing where you have respect of physical limits. You have to time match your power purchases. You have to look at what boundary can I buy that power from, like what EU country or bidding zone in the European case. And then you go to the green accounting world and you're in a parallel universe. You're in a world that doesn't really respect any of those limits and rules. And so that has caused, yes, some controversy, let's say, as you covered earlier. about these green claims, about companies getting to 100% renewable without actually doing the real job of getting to 100% renewable.
Yeah, we should just say that like the standard right now is basically that you can buy RECs from anywhere, annually averaged from any geography. There are currently no geographic or temporal restrictions on where you can buy RECs. Is that correct?
Well,
there's some level, right? Like, so
Yeah.
there's some level of restrictions, but you can buy it from anywhere in Europe. So one example we always use is Iceland, which has never exported an electron, but it's quite a big exporter of green electricity certificates, right? So there's no geographical limits
Because of geothermal.
that makes sense, or hydro in Iceland.
Oh, right. hydro.
And also then you can be solar powered at night. And that's the other kind of classic one to do with the temporality. You can use solar produced in May on a dark winter's night in December and claim to be renewable at that time. And so this time matching and geographical matching just don't make any kind of physical sense when we think about the classic way that power works on electricity grids and power markets.
I want to throw this in too, even though we'll return to it later, but this is also in the news because this distinction between what you're actually consuming and what you're claiming via RECs is coming up now because of data centers. So you have these data centers like Meta, et cetera, who are building a bunch of gas plants, building a bunch of gas generators to run them, and then buying these RECs from, wherever, California, and claiming to be 100% clean. So people are noticing this in a way that is new, I think, is becoming a political issue in a way that is new, I think.
Yeah. And like, just to be clear, all of the major tech company brands, they're all already 100% renewable and have been, some of them for many years.
Right. According to this current standard.
Yes, of course. That's what they claim. And it's not because they're fudging the rules. Those are the rules. They're following the rules.
Right.
And they're reporting zero emissions. And that objectively is absurd and doesn't make any sense when we see what's actually happening out in the real world, right? So that's one of the main reasons why this reform process was kicked off and why we are where we are today. So we've been working on this for about a year, Wilson and I. Wilson can go through a bit like in more detail why these changes are needed. But basically yesterday or 2 days ago, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol put out a draft that basically would significantly tighten up these rules.
We're going to go through the changes they make in some detail. I just want to get a little like roadmap, a little clarity on what's happening process-wise. Like people are going to comment on this draft, then there's going to be another draft. How many drafts? When is there going to be a final? What is the process as you understand it?
Yeah, so basically there's a comment period open now for the next 60 days. So people are going to comment on that largely publicly. Then the technical working group that we're in, so we've been working on this for about a year. We're going to take those comments and work through them, see which ones are most relevant in alignment with the kind of criteria and governance of the process, and then come up with a secondary draft. There may be a second comment period next year. And the idea is that 2027 is when we'll really have a finalized new version of the protocol. However, that might phase in only, a couple of years after that, let's say, right? So we're still relatively, early in the process, but critically, a lot of the key decisions are being made right now. And we'll talk about them in more detail later on.
Right. Okay, so let's then talk about those changes that are being made in this draft that has just come out. So this draft is the subject of everybody's attention and focus right now. There are several changes that I want to go through, but the first two I think are the most notable because they're about this granularity that we've been discussing. The first says we're going to move from annual accounting of your energy use to hourly. So people are going to have to match, they're going to have to buy RECs from the hours of the day that they are actually consuming energy, which gets into who's going to produce those hourly RECs, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the first is about temporal granularity. The second is about geographic granularity. It says no longer can you just buy them from anywhere in the U.S., like taking the U.S. example, you can't just buy anywhere in the U.S. You have to buy from, and the language here is a little fuzzy, but you have to buy it from a grid where you plausibly could have physically accessed it at the time you were producing it. So basically temporally much more granular and then geographically much more granular. So Wilson, let's go to you. I think the merits of doing this, I discussed this on the last pod, and I think they're just pretty evident. The merits of doing this, the reason people want to do this is just accuracy, basically. Like, you can't be claiming to offset your energy when you're buying from some faraway time, faraway place grid. It's more accurate to say your claims are more accurate if you're buying closer. That's the merits of doing this. But there are also risks. So I wanted to ask you about some of those, both you, really. My first question is just this. It seems on its face that this is a little bit more complicated. Buying annual RECs from just anywhere is very, very easy. This requires a little bit more administration, a little bit more calculation, a little bit more, just a little bit more. The soft costs are up. Do you not worry about that just in and of itself reducing participation in this market? Because the background fact here is that all the companies doing this are doing it voluntarily. So are you worried at all, just on its face, about the increased complication reducing participation?
I would say that while there is increased complication here, it's not to the extent that it should make it very difficult for these large companies that are sophisticated enough to actually go out and buy their own actual electricity to do the accounting at a granularity that's equivalent to what they're buying power on. When it comes to actually reporting this, what you're essentially saying is that rather than reporting a single number for a given grid, you're now reporting 8,760 number of hours in a year.
Yeah.
And that's a larger spreadsheet, but fundamentally, there's nothing significantly different about that compared to just adding up all the RECs you purchased over the year. There will be some administrative barrier. And for that reason, the current proposal is actually only recommending that this be required of the largest companies. So if you're, a small mom and pop business and you don't want to deal with your larger spreadsheet, you're still welcome to, but you don't have to. And that threshold for what determines a small company hasn't been fully determined yet, but...
Yeah. There's several feasibility measures that we're going to mention later. That's one of them, is just this only applies to big companies, but it's not clear exactly what's big, what counts as big.
Yeah, but when it comes down to the logistics of actually making these claims, what you really need is a measure of when electricity was produced and where, which any large-scale electricity generator that participates in a power market is going to have and can be feasibly attached to the actual certificate that you're using. And then you just need to keep track of it, which is, again, not trivial, but it's not at the level that it should prevent any reasonably sized company from pursuing this if they want to. I also do want to kind of circle back to the arguments in favor, because I don't think that they're just about this is more accurate. I think that is one very important aspect of this. Obviously, it's not credible when you say your data center in Virginia runs on 100% solar power from Texas. But there's also a few aspects of the way these incentives actually drive action that I and I think others who are working on this updated standard think will actually incentivize more impactful actions on behalf of these companies. One of the major challenges with the existing standard is that it essentially allows you to claim 100% clean power using whatever variable renewable resource offers the cheapest megawatt hour in some time and place, even though we know that to actually decarbonize any given grid, you're going to need a rather diverse mix of technologies. And so even though corporate procurement has been really impactful when it comes to scaling up wind and solar power, there's essentially no incentive for these companies to do the same thing for things like clean firm power or energy storage or demand side management, which are all key for overall decarbonization, but they don't deliver the cheapest clean megawatt hour. Their role is to deliver a clean megawatt hour in a time and place where it's hard to do that.
It's worth saying now and probably for the foreseeable future, like just a bulk daytime megawatt hour of solar is going to be cheapest probably for a while.
Yeah, possibly forever.
Maybe forever, right? So, as you say, one of the benefits here is to push some of that investment, to technologies that can produce at those hours when maybe solar isn't, or wind and solar aren't the famous clean firm. But the flip side of that is there's less supply for those hours, right? Those technologies are less developed. There's just less, that's a less robust, a less robust market, which is going to mean that those RECs are going to be more expensive.
Yes.
I think it's fair to say, which means getting to 100% clean, quote unquote, is going to be more expensive under this regime. And we might say, well, it's good. It reflects the actual cost of doing it more accurately. But again, do you worry, like, so much of this market is driven by optics, right? Like, companies want to say we're 100% clean. Is a company going to want to say we are 65% clean? Do you know what I mean? Like, do you, again, worry that by pushing up the cost of getting to 100 and making the whole thing kind of a little bit more ambiguous about what people have accomplished, or at least making the reputational benefits less clear, again, do you worry about discouraging people?
I don't think so, as long as everyone's on a level playing field. And to be honest, I think that the standard being 100% as it is now has been really unhealthy for the sector, because it is meaningless when everyone is 100%. If, as Syndrome says, if everyone's super, no one is. And to throw in a sick reference there. And so, you've got companies claiming since 2020 that they're already at 100%. They effectively have nothing left to do under that standard except keep up with load growth. And when you move to a system that actually makes it more difficult to get to 100%, because actually achieving 100% clean physical supply is much more difficult, you then actually start to see the distinction between companies that are doing an A+ job versus just a B job. And you can actually get to the point where people start to recognize that, say, 75% hourly and location match clean power is actually a very praiseworthy achievement that we should recognize.
Well, this is the question, right? Like, you and I will know that. Mm-hmm. We, the people involved in this market will know that. But this is like, you can't assume any knowledge of anything on the part of the public. And part of my question about all this is just like, what is the public going to make of it when, in 2027, all of a sudden, lots of companies aren't clean anymore, and almost no one's clean, and like people are halfway clean or 65% clean. Like, I wonder about the public perception of it all.
Sometimes the public knowledge of how this stuff works is pretty, just in taking the example of my parents, for example, when I explain to them what I do and that, like, some of the data centers...
You poor man.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but, I have to try to get through it. So Ireland, for example, where I'm from, so about 25% of electricity in Ireland is consumed by data centers. So that's by far the most in the world, proportionately. So it's a big topic in the public domain. And when I tell them that actually these are all 100% renewable, there's a few eyebrows raised, and then I say, well, it's kind of sometimes based on this system of certificates where they can take one from Norway, a bit from Spain, and then they're like, that's what's happening. I think anyone can understand that. Like, people without an understanding of the electricity sector, if they take 5 minutes to dig a bit deeper into these rules, they know on the face of them, the claims are not realistic. And I think if we just try to continue hoodwinked and thinking, the only way for these markets to progress and the only way for companies to actually remain committed to buying renewables is if they can claim renewables in a way that's just not respecting reality, we're going to get attacked from all sides, right? Even from people who are not necessarily advocates for renewable energy. They'll say, well, obviously the only way of really being renewable is to fudge your rules and to pretend you're solar powered at night. So I don't really buy it. And I kind of agree with Wilson here that we need a bit of a reset about what's actually acceptable. Because if you're starting from a point of, we need to kind of design the accounting system so that everyone can be 100% renewable by 2030.
It's a little participation trophy-esque.
Like, what are we really doing there? Because that's a very hard task, right? And I think we need to just kind of be realistic about where folks are at, and to kind of make sure to get to 100% or zero, you have to jump through all the hoops that everyone has to jump through to get there. More renewables, more demand response, more flexibility, more clean firm power. It doesn't make any sense that a subset kind of get to do that with kind of a half-baked solution, and then everyone else has to deal with the kind of the more, complicated parts of that transition. So I think we do need that reset. And it will ultimately value the actual really great work a lot of companies do in buying clean energy, right? Yeah. Let's not forget, there's billions of dollars going into this stuff already today. And we need to make sure that, like, by 2040, that the standards, or 2035, because that's what we're talking about here, a standard update that'll probably come in by 2030, that'll probably be there until 2040.
Yeah.
Like, we really need to think about what's relevant in the next 10, 15 years, not in the last 10.
Well, let's turn to another question a lot of people raise about this. So right now, most of the market is what's called a spot market. Most of the market for RECs is just a spot market where you just go buy individual RECs from a big pool. And then a small fraction of these purchases are through power purchase agreements, PPAs. And a hugely disproportionate amount of the impact of this market on getting renewable energy built is from those PPAs. It's the spot market that really, like, it's those spot purchases that really come in for criticism, that they basically have very little impact. Like, you can be a solar plant that was built 10 years ago and still be producing RECs, dumping them into this pool. And if you buy those RECs, you're not getting anything new built. So the PPAs are what's driving a lot of the impact. And one of the worries here is that, so if I'm a corporate and I sign a PPA with a generator, I'm saying I'm going to buy all the power that you generate. And that de-risks that for that project developer. And that's how they get funding, et cetera, et cetera. But if I'm a corporate and I'm dealing with a generator, I don't want all their power. I only want the power they're producing at the times that are hourly matched to my consumption. So either I'm not going to promise to buy all their power, in which case I'll have a sort of weaker effect, a trimmed down PPA, or I have to do I have to buy 400% of the energy I actually use to actually cover my hourly, to actually cover all my hours. So in other words, does this not make PPAs more difficult? And is that not bad because PPAs are most of the oomph in this market?
I don't think it makes them more difficult. And in fact, I think it even incentivizes them. When you look at the example you just gave of why sign a PPA with a solar plant when I can only use it part of the day, I think the answer there is you don't sign a PPA with a solar plant that's big enough to cover your total volumetric use, because obviously you don't need, if it's enough to supply the amount of power you use around the clock, you don't need the part that generates during the day. What you instead want to do there is just buy a PPA from a smaller solar plant and buy a PPA from a wind plant to cover the other hours, or add on a battery to shift the power from the peak when you're not using it into the times when you are short. And that kind of action is what actually helps to decarbonize those hours in the grid. But when it comes to the incentives to sign long-term contracts, I think one thing that gets overlooked a lot is that the current system essentially decouples the action of deciding what power to buy and the action of deciding what RECs to buy. When you go out and want to say you're using decarbonized power, you go to your utility, you ask them for whatever power they can give you at whatever price is cheapest, and then you go out and try to find RECs. And the easiest way to do that is to buy unbundled ones. You can sign long-term contracts, which a lot of companies do, and which are more impactful, and that's, again, something we should be incentivizing. But those contracts are really not worth very much from an electricity purchasing perspective, because they're usually what are called virtual PPAs, where you are buying power on some other grid, and then you're reselling it into that grid. And so the actual value of that power to you as a power consumer is very low, because the price that you're selling that power for in that other grid might be less than the price you're paying for power in your grid, and they might not be very correlated, and so it doesn't act as a good hedge. Whereas if you have to buy clean power from the grid where you're consuming it and during the times when you're consuming it, you might as well also buy the physical power from those same resources. And you're going to be incentivized to buy that under a long-term contract, because then it will actually act as a hedge. You will be able to pay a fixed price for electricity in a way that's directly beneficial to you. And so there's very little reason for a company that has to actually buy power that's matched with their physical consumption to not go and try to hedge that with the actual long-term offtake of that generator's power.
What about the sort of geographic version of this problem where, say, I'm a corporate with highly sort of dispersed load, let's say, I don't know, a supermarket or something. I have stores all over the country, none of which are in and of themselves particularly huge loads. But if I can aggregate them, I can get enough demand to sign a PPA, justify a PPA. But if I have to match the demand of each of those stores to the grid that store is in, I can no longer aggregate them basically across geographies. What's to be done about that problem?
Yeah, I think this could be a legitimate problem for a small subset of companies that are both large enough to aggregate a PPA from all their load over a country and not large enough to aggregate their load into a PPA in the various grid regions that that country is now going to be made up from, and are also not subject to any of these, small business feasibility exemptions that are being proposed. But the reality is that the vast, vast majority of current corporate offtake in the form of PPAs comes from companies that are easily large enough to sign many, many PPAs in any of the grid regions they operate in. I think there's also another pathway for companies that may run into this problem, which is that there's going to be a much larger role for aggregators who are actually going out and signing PPA. These could be utilities, these could be independent power purchasers, but who go out and actually sign PPAs for clean power in a given region and try to create this time-matched supply with the intent of then selling that on to a customer pool whose load they aggregate across, all of these different offerings. And there hasn't really been a business incentive for that to the present date, but I think it's something we're going to see evolve if this moves forward.
Just like service providers who are helping people do this.
Yes.
So in general, outside of the US, so in Europe, it's about 80% of these PPAs are actually physically delivered, right? So that's the norm outside of the US. It is a different situation in the US, but outside the US, most PPAs are physically delivered. And everywhere in the world, including the US, obviously, the more correlated your demand is in time and space to the output of your PPA, the more that is going to actually hedge your operational power needs. So that was my job before. I used to buy and hedge electricity. And so you're always going to have a deeper pool of appetite for risk, in my view, on long-term power for, electricity that's actually needed to run a data center or to run a factory, and that you want to lock in the costs for a certain amount of time. So I actually think personally that we urgently need to focus on PPAs that are more around the clock, that are matched more to the demand profile of electricity consumers for a healthy PPA market in the long run.
Well, let me ask about that then, because you're on the subject. One of the things I thought could happen to make PPAs more around the clock, what if instead of, investing in geothermal and storage and the things that we would like people to invest in, they just pull in existing hydro or nuclear? That would just pull some of the demand away from renewables without really inducing any new clean firm. And wouldn't that always be kind of the easiest way to get a little firmer? Easier than like funding some geothermal startup or something?
Yeah. So I guess one point is that they can already do that. We're only making improvements from here, but there's actually part of the proposal that we haven't gotten to yet that does look to address that. And this is the concept of standard supply service, which has not existed in the GHGP to date, at least in a kind of formalized sense, though it has been alluded to.
Okay, wait, can we, I am going to get a whole thing on the standard supply service. We can't just do that on a drive-by because I'm so confused by it that we need to spend some real time on it. So I got a few questions left about PPAs.
We'll table standard supply service. That is a partial solution to the concern.
That's a critical element of the answer, though. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to it then. This was my other big question then about the geography element of this, which is just the simple question, like, what if you're on a grid in a state with statutory climate targets where utilities have to, by law, supply renewables? Then if you're required to procure clean energy from your grid, aren't you just helping the utility comply with a statutory target at that point? Aren't you just sort of like donating your money to the state for compliance?
Oh, I think that's also standard supply service. There is not a requirement to do that. It obviously depends on how you structure these things. But when a company goes out and when the utility has a mandate to deliver them, say, 70% clean power, part of the standard supply service concept is that if the company is on that utility's standard product, then they get to claim their fair share of that. And then anything beyond that is something that they have to go out and procure voluntarily. And importantly, they have to retire the RECs themselves. So they can't count towards, a government program that also requires retirement of those same instruments. So that lets it end up being kind of additional on top of whatever the state would have been doing.
Got it. There will be cases where I'm consuming energy on a relatively clean grid. Mm-hmm. So now with these new rules, instead of, say, inducing a bunch more solar to be built on a dirty grid far away, I'm instead spending money on a grid that's already pretty clean just to make it incrementally cleaner. In other words, I will have less carbon impact in the latter case than in the former. I guess, mathematically, we have to concede that that's a possibility, right? I mean, that could happen under this.
It's a possibility.
Something to also keep in mind, there's two kind of joint consultations out. So if a company really does want to go and buy power that they can't consume because, they want to do that for an abatement reason, for example, there are methodologies being developed called impact or consequential accounting methods, but that would allow you to go and do that anywhere. My major concern about this is that we might focus on edge cases, like you mentioned, to say, do you know what, we don't need boundaries anywhere.
Right.
And then you get a very leaky system like what we have today, where companies kind of may say that they're going to go and procure in a more complicated region, but may just go and procure in a cheaper region to cover their more dirty consumption in other regions. So I do think we need to tighten up the inventory of what you can reasonably claim to consume, and then have another way for people to actually go out and buy real abatements. But it is a different thing. We can't mix apples and oranges in that sense. And I think it's important to keep those two things separate.
Yeah. So I think the kind of premise of that question, I think it's actually likely to be the opposite, where currently the system essentially incentivizes companies to go to the places where they can procure RECs the cheapest, the times and places,
right,
which are almost by definition going to be the places where renewable energy is already the most competitive and being built just because it has a essentially zero or negative green premium over the fossil alternative,
right,
which in turn leads to these purchases having essentially zero impact. And so if we're instead requiring companies to purchase where they happen to be, say the data center company in Virginia has to actually source clean power from the eastern region of PJM rather than Texas, they're going to have to go to those more expensive resources that may not actually be economic otherwise. And the research that I and others have done modeling this out shows that that actually has decidedly more impact than the current system, even at lower levels of participation. This question about whether your purchases are additional, I know that's something you got into in the last pod, but it's really essential to understanding why the current system is flawed, and also how we should be thinking about design of both the kind of updated Scope 2 emissions inventories and this concept of the impact accounting that Killian referenced.
Now, let's get to the third big change, which is proposed by this discussion draft, which is the standard supply service concept. So, Wilson, tell us, what does that mean? How does it work now? And what's the proposed change?
Yeah, so this one is admittedly a bit in the weeds, but essentially the motivation for this is that there are a lot of resources on the grid that were, say, built by governments way back in the day, or, they're built by a regulated utility. Everyone is forced to pay for these things. And yet the current Scope 2 system essentially allows for some companies to come in, and if they can do some negotiation to actually access the clean attributes from those resources, they can kind of claim them all for themselves, even though it kind of by rights, those should be socialized among everyone who's on that grid and able to use them.
Right.
And so what Standard Supply Service is doing is essentially saying it's formalizing the idea that certain classes of resources, ones that are government mandated or owned or regulated, where essentially all ratepayers have a mandatory financial relationship with those resources.
Right.
That one company can't come in and just hoover that up and claim to be 100% clean because, they get 100% share from those resources in a grid where they only make up 20% of the generation. So you can't come in and say, I'm 100% nuclear powered in Louisiana, when, nuclear power is only a fraction of Louisiana's grid. And what this is essentially requiring is that everyone gets to claim their, say, 25% nuclear powered or hydropowered in a grid that's 25% one of those when that falls under the standard supply service concept. So like Bonneville Power Authority hydro, or regulated nuclear, or Norwegian hydro. All these things, everyone kind of gets their base share. And then if you want to get to 100%, if that grid isn't actually 100% clean from those resources, you then have to go out and procure other things. And you aren't allowed to take someone else's kind of fair share of that. So I think the motivation is in part about, again, ensuring this kind of fairness aspect where a company shouldn't get to claim my nuclear power if I'm a ratepayer. But one kind of byproduct of this is that it removes from the voluntary pool a lot of these old legacy large baseload resources that were built under these structures.
How big is that class of sort of communal power?
I've seen it estimated that it covers more than 75% of the existing large nuclear and hydro fleets, at least in the US. So it's a very sizable portion.
And what's going to happen if the rules change to the people who are currently claiming a disproportionate share of those? Is that going to get grandfathered in? I mean, that's sort of a broader question. Like, are current arrangements going to get grandfathered in under this change? Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who change majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. Are current arrangements going to get grandfathered in under this change?
I think one other thing that is probably obvious, but I think it's worth underlining, so whether it be in Europe or the US or elsewhere, obviously these assets that will probably be in standard supply, they're obviously built decades ago, they've been paid off, they're amortized, so they can basically sell RECs for next to nothing. So look at the price of a REC in Europe. It's about 40 cent euro per megawatt hour from the standard pool, and half of that goes to admin fees. So you have this incredibly cheap certificate that basically bottoms out the price for everyone else. And so it's trying to take that bottom out of the market that we see in the certificate market in Europe, for example. That obviously means that actually the assets that really need the money, they don't get it, because at the end of the day, economic actors are going to go for the cheapest thing possible, and it all gives you the same 100% renewable claim. So I think that is a really important aspect, and also quite significant in Europe. Like that base loady hydro nuclear, it makes up quite a lot of the percentage of renewable output in a lot of European countries.
This will lift the floor.
This would be part of lifting the floor. Obviously, so would the other two pillars, but this would be significant because often, again, these are assets that are often kind of clean firm, right? So they could really bottom out the prices that otherwise would be picked up by something like storage or a new clean firm like geothermal.
Yeah.
So this does get to the previous question about PPAs just pulling in.
Yeah, it does.
Existing hydro nuclear. They won't be able to under this new rule.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else about standard supply service, Wilson? Or and one other possibly even more wonky thing is an updated definition of the residual mix. Do we care about that? I'm entirely open to the possibility that that's too wonky for us to care about.
I think, just to be brief, Yes, this will have actually a massive impact on the emissions reported by companies, because basically anything that's not matched, so you don't have a specific contract for it. Before, what would happen, basically everywhere outside of Europe or sometimes in the US, people would just say, and in that case, I am powered by the grid average power, which includes all existing renewables, all existing clean firm. And that will no longer be allowed. So now you have to go to this thing called a residual mix that takes out a lot of the claimed clean power already, or defaulting to a fossil mix.
Right, because if you claim for that remaining bit that you haven't accounted for, I'm using the grid mix, you are claiming a bunch of clean energy in that grid that other entities are claiming for their RECs. So you're having double claiming now.
Exactly.
So instead of using the grid average for this residual bit, you'll probably use something called a fossil fuel average, basically just like the dirty stuff.
Or a residual mix, which is a bit more of a kind of a more sophisticated fossil average, let's say, but we don't want to get into the weeds on that. But I think at a high level, it actually is something not to ignore, right? It is actually quite significant.
All right. So those are kind of the big ones. We got temporal granularity, geographic granularity. We got the standard supply service thing. So you're no longer allowed to just dip into these giant pools of boring old already built nuclear and hydro. And for your residual mix, now you're not allowed to double claim clean resources that other people claimed, all of which is just going to tighten this up, make things slightly more difficult, raise the bar, as it were. So like claiming you are 100% clean under these new rules is going to mean a lot more than it did before these new rules. And so there are several provisions in here about feasibility, which whenever I look at, I've been trained by, sort of looking at U.S. legislation. Whenever I get to this section of things, it just reads to me like who lobbied, who lobbied loudest here to get their feasibility requirements tucked into the final thing here. So for one thing, this just exempts small companies, like we mentioned before. So does that just mean that small companies will just be able to do things the way we're doing them now? Like there'll be no changes for the small companies, or what does that mean exactly?
For the small companies, I think that the main initial exemption is about the requirement to do an hourly accounting rather than an annual. So it's more on that pillar than the other two. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Wilson, but that's what I think is in the draft, right? Basically, I personally am supportive of that because I do think in terms of like balance of admin burden versus impact, there is a strong case for just saying, listen, SMEs. So just to give some numbers, right? Like, so if you look at CDP data, so this is like the Carbon Disclosure Project of companies who publicly report their electricity consumption, 7% of companies report about 75% of electricity consumption. So you have like a really, it's basically like, 10% of companies.
That's not even the 80-20 rule. That's
even stronger than the 80-20.
The 93.
Right? Yeah, whatever, But we're in that kind of ballpark. So yeah, like, are we going to, I think there's a bigger risk of ultimately the rules for everyone being overly relaxed and us missing out on that accuracy overall, rather than just kind of being a bit pragmatic and saying, listen, SMEs, you can move to hourly later or maybe continue doing annual for the next 10, 15 years or whatever, right? I think that's not unreasonable because I think it's super important that the major consumers do report more accurately.
Right. Another feasibility thing is that corporates that signed long-term contracts under the old rules will get grandfathered in. Is that objectionable at all or particularly significant, do you think?
I feel mixed about this. And to be clear, I think this is one of the least formed areas of the proposal. It's something that I think is going to be a main focus of some of the work that we do in the next year, is how exactly this works, how the transition between the current and kind of updated standards works. Mm-hmm. But the current proposal is to allow some mechanism for companies that sign contracts under the current rules to keep counting those under the current rules for some period of time. And the kind of reasoning behind that is that you don't want to disincentivize companies from signing contracts because they're afraid that the rules might change at some point in the future. And so this is kind of a sort of trust building mechanism. It's not great from a, accuracy of the standards perspective. But I think if there's, for example, one thing that is being included in the consultation is the question of whether a company should have to disclose whether they use that kind of legacy provision. And I think that would be very healthy to say, like...
Interesting. What does it say now?
Yeah, because you can essentially, that's something that can help you compare apples to apples or figure out if you're comparing apples to apples where one company happened to, be making very heavy use of this. So they're essentially just using the old system to make some claim versus another company that isn't. But this is an admittedly tricky area, given that we're making, the proposed changes are fairly comprehensive and aren't necessarily fully backwards compatible in terms of the reporting.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of wonder what else you would do. You don't want to dissolve all existing contracts, but I mean, very few existing contracts are going to conform to the new rule, right? I mean, I don't know how else you'd get around this.
Exactly. I mean, there's some things you can do. You can add storage to, if you're in the same
that
grid
solves
region.
all problems, Wilson. That solves literally all grid problems.
But I mean, if you're in Texas and you bought a bunch of wind and solar PPAs, then you can, and you're producing more than you need at some points, you can add storage and that can help you out. But I think there is this is something that the, Secretariat, the working group are very cognizant of, is making sure that kind of trust in these structures and markets persists and that people can continue signing contracts for clean power with confidence, while at the same time making sure that we do move to this new system where, going forward, these purchasing practices are much more healthily directed.
Yeah, for long-term power purchase agreements where there's a long-term commitment to power, I would say probably on balance globally, most of those will anyway comply because a lot of them are matched to load. A lot of them outside of the US especially are physically delivered already. So I don't think it's so much of an issue there. So I understand, listen, if a company's made a multi-$100 million commitment over 15 years to buy power, yeah, I can see why there's a kind of a reasoning there for some form of grandfathering. I think we do need to be careful that the terms are not too vague so that alongside those contracts, you kind of have these unbundled REC costing 40 cent a megawatt hour, the whole Norwegian hydro fleet gets grandfathered through to the next era. That would be a bit of a mess. So I think we do need some rules around what are the long-term contracts that we should allow through this flexibility and what are the ones we kind of need to be careful about ensuring are not getting through because they could really bottom out the whole impact of what we're trying to do here.
Right. Yeah, there's been some bad experiences with grandfathering stuff in U.S. environmental legislation. I think we can all cite a few examples. The draft kind of waves its hands at phased implementation, but it just strikes me that that could mean a lot of different things and potentially could mean a lot, just quantity-wise. Whether you start now or 5 years from now, that's a lot of greenhouse gases involved in that decision. So where is that discussion?
I think this discussion is sort of the main focus of the next phase of work for the TWG. It is going to be important exactly how this phase-in happens. I think we can say for certain that because the final rules are going to be kind of put out in 2027, it probably won't be an immediate hard cut into new hourly reporting. It's something that's obviously going to take time to, that people need to have fair warning once the decision's finalized. But the question of exactly how the phase-in works and when updated reporting is required, how existing target setting is kind of considered going forward, because companies do have their 100% clean by 2030 targets. I think making sure that all happens smoothly is going to be the kind of main work of the next phase once we have a sense for what the updated rules are actually going to be.
Yeah, well, assuming that something like these rules in this draft go into force, I just kind of want to think for a minute about how this will play out on the ground. You have these data centers. A lot of this is about data centers. You have these data centers, huge data centers, getting up to gigawatt type data centers. And so if I'm a gigawatt data center and I'm owned by a company that's going 100%, quote unquote, 100% clean by 2030, and these new rules are in effect, I mean, they probably won't be by the time for 2030, but let's say the target's 2035, whatever. As a data center, if I want to claim to be run on 100% clean energy, I'm going to have to find a gigawatt of steady supply at night somehow.
Yeah.
And furthermore, if like another data center and another data center also move into Virginia with me, all of a sudden we're looking for 3 gigawatts of supply at night. There just aren't that. You know what I mean? So like, it seems to me, at least at the beginning of this, it's not just going to be like a challenge to get to 100. Like a lot of places, like I don't see how these companies are going to hit their targets. Like, how are you going to find 3 gigawatts of nighttime supply before 2030 or before 2035? You know what I mean? Like, do you think that this is going to put those targets out of reach?
Well, first of all, it is hard to be 100% clean powered. Just to be blunt, right? That is hard in most places. And anything we do to just paper over that and say, actually, do you know what? I'm going to build a gas turbine and pretend I'm 100% clean powered, I think is just bringing us backwards anyway. So that's the first point. I think in terms of the phase in, yeah, probably it'll be 2030, something like this, or a bit after that. I'm not sure where we land there. I don't want it to get too far into the 2030s because that's, concerning. And then again, I think we do, depending on the region that data center is being built or that factory is being built, we do need to have a discussion about what's an actual credible target for how clean powered that data center is. And I think it does create incentives to actually look at more around the clock technologies, these clean firm technologies. I think in very, very sunny places, you could actually get probably further than we think by 2035 with solar and batteries. I know there's a project under construction at the moment in Abu Dhabi that's 97% baseload solar, right? And that's under construction right now. So we are, given the, how fast battery prices are dropping, we may get closer in certain places than one would think to real, actual clean power or close to 100% clean power. So I guess the message there is like, yeah, listen, being actually 100% is hard sometimes, and we have to acknowledge that.
I guess maybe just to put it more sort of like bluntly, like a bunch of these companies made these goals with the current rules in mind, right? Like that's the level of difficulty that they were committing to. Mm-hmm. And now the targets are in place. And if the rules change, all of a sudden, basically you are, whether they want it or not, their targets are now committing them to a much greater level of effort, a much greater level of spending and effort. And I just wonder about, honestly, like the political economy of that. I wonder how they are thinking about that. Like they must, like Meta, whatever, Amazon, Microsoft, they must know that if these changes go into effect, all of a sudden their 100% targets are a lot more ambitious than they used to be. Like, do they know that?
Yeah, I think they know that. And I think it does become a public communications kind of challenge where you have to say, look, like, these targets that we are currently shooting for were made under the existing rule set. And we might even end up in a situation where, a lot of these companies have 2030 targets. We get to 2030, everyone's hit their 2030 targets because it's super easy to hit that target.
And then the rules change and they unhit them.
Yeah, and then we say, okay, everyone's done that, great job. And now we move on to the actual work of achieving, physical decarbonized supply. And everyone kind of resets at that point under the new rules.
Yeah. I'm trying to imagine being Meta's PR person explaining to Meta customers, like, no, we were 100% powered by renewable energy in 2030, but now it's 2031, and all of a sudden we're like 60% powered by renewable energy, still heading to 100, but like, we didn't back down our ambitions, right? The rules changed under us. That's just, I don't know. That's a tricky communications.
It'll be a little awkward. I'm sure their communications people will come up with a way to kind of communicate that favorably, especially if they're doing well relative to their peers.
Exactly.
I think it's also just the case that we cannot let the awkwardness of saying, oops, we're not actually 100% anymore, get in the way of creating a system that actually accurately represents where people are.
All right. Final thing I want to discuss. We touched on it earlier. I think a lot of people, especially if they're not familiar with all of this, the rules and the technical aspects and stuff, just like if they're just looking at these claims, on the tin, I think people are assuming that these companies are making greenhouse gas emissions claims. I think people assume that the amount that you say you run on clean energy corresponds to your emissions impact. But as we're discussing earlier, emissions impact, like a system that measures your impact on the system and a system that measures your inventory, are separate systems. This is that we're talking about here is an inventory system. And so the idea now in this discussion draft is, because I think a lot of people also have the very strong intuition that we ought to measure emissions impact, and not just be measuring who gets their electrons where. So what is the logic of kind of hiving this off into a separate measurement? And what is that going to look like? Are there going to be like two sets of claims now? Like if I'm Google, I'm like, on one hand, run on X amount of clean energy, and on another hand, have offset all my emissions? Or are we just going to report those separately? What's the logic here behind splitting consequential accounting off into its own thing?
I think the logic here is to avoid, for one, conflating the two within the same number, which I think is even less informative than splitting them off. Where currently it's not true consequential accounting, but we're sort of saying that, I'm consuming power in one place and that's effectively being offset by RECs I'm buying from somewhere else.
I think people hear it as an emissions claim.
Exactly. And I think that's something that needs to be kind of better communicated as just that. And I think that's something the GHGP can really help to emphasize, is what kind of claims can you actually make with, based on these different numbers. The Scope 2 system is an inventory system where it's essentially, and I think some people will quibble with this because of, concerns over what constitutes a legitimate claim to use. But Scope 2, by definition, is saying, here is the emissions embodied in the power I'm using, which is a relevant factor because it measures how exposed you are to things like climate policy. I think one of our hopes with kind of the updated Scope 2 proposal is that the actions that you take to reduce the emissions embodied in your electricity supply are also actions that have impact in driving new clean power onto the grid in the times and places where it's needed most. But it's not explicitly a measure of impact. And that's where this idea of consequential accounting comes in, which is trying to say, okay, I did X, Y, and Z, and therefore carbon emissions fell by this amount. And this is something that is a pretty fundamentally different thing from inventories, where you're basically adding up the emissions that you get to claim. Consequential accounting is asking, in this counterfactual world where I didn't take this action, how would emissions have been different? And this is something that is also a fundamental question behind carbon offsets. The question of additionality is a main.
Because let me ask you this, like this consequential accounting, like you could see consequential accounting applied specifically to electricity, specifically to Scope 2, but obviously like there's a million actions a corporation can take that affect emissions that have nothing to do with electricity. Is the electricity part of consequential accounting just going to be sort of subsumed in a larger consequential accounting scheme that addresses all their actions?
I think that's an open question, and there's an actions and market instruments working group that is looking into that. I think the reason that there's an electricity-specific tack on the consequential accounting side is that electricity is weird compared to other commodities, compared to other actions, just the way electricity systems work. And so it requires some kind of sector-specific expertise to design a system that's robust. And I want to kind of emphasize here, we are not at that system yet. I think consequential accounting in the electricity sector is something that is promising and that I'm glad we're pursuing, because companies should have an outlet for saying, okay, I can't zero out my inventory, but I've taken these other actions that are impactful. But the existing proposal, it's very fraught, because for the exact same reason that carbon markets have lost credibility, proposals for consequential accounting in the electricity sector are very vulnerable to allowing and even incentivizing companies to make claims that vastly overstate the carbon impact of their actions and are essentially unverifiable.
This was my second question, is like, do we know how to do this? Because consequential accounting in other areas, like in the areas of carbon offsets, et cetera, is like just notoriously gameable, notoriously sort of fraught. No one really feels like they have that nailed down. I was just wondering, like, do we have a better handle on it in the electricity sector than we do at large? Because consequential accounting at large does not look like it's doing particularly well.
Yeah, so I think the answer is right now, no. Pretty emphatically, no. I think there's a decent chance we can get there to a system that is sufficiently robust and sufficiently widely acknowledged as robust and conservative enough to enable claims that we consider to be, good enough, even though we can't fundamentally verify them. But as it stands, there's pretty significant academic disagreement over how you actually estimate the carbon impact of electricity sector actions.
Yeah.
And it's not, at the extent of, we have plus or minus 20% uncertainty. This is one method says your impact is 20, 30, 40 times greater than the other one.
Right.
And, if we're dealing with the potential pitfalls here, the main one is really that you get credited with actions that are not actually additional. You're, saying that your actions caused more clean power to be on the grid somewhere in the world than otherwise would have. And that's not true, either because the project didn't need your financing to be competitive or because it competed with another project of the same type. And so if we don't have ways to really rigorously verify that, then for the exact same reason that companies currently get their RECs from the cheapest projects possible, which are also the ones that are least likely to need the money, you get the exact same phenomenon here where, it's kind of a race to the bottom of the cheapest offset becomes the projects that are least likely to actually be legitimate offsets, which is, again, the main problem with the voluntary carbon market. And it's acknowledged as a problem in electricity sector offsets, which are actually a thing, but the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market recently actually decided that they weren't going to give the highest certification to electricity sector offsets, specifically because renewable technologies are so broadly competitive around the world that it's really hard to verify whether they actually needed the funding and whether anything you do with them is actually additional. So that's the hard work of this. I don't think it's impossible to do, but it's something where the pitfalls are really, really significant if we get it wrong.
Yeah.
I sort of lean impossible, or at least I wouldn't want large sums of money turning on precise answers to that question. Let's put it that way. If this is all just about what is your level of bragging rights on some sort of badge you put on your website or whatever, that's fine. But I feel like some of these problems are kind of insoluble.
But I think just one thing that is important to keep in mind. So this protocol is actually in European legislation. So European companies are obliged to use the protocol or a standard similar to it. So this is in law in Europe. We're also developing a carbon border adjustment mechanism that is going to be based as well on the fundamental principles of what's the emissions of electricity. And then verifiability becomes basically you can't get around that. You have to base it on things like time of production, location of production. They are verifiable things that you can link to consumption. And I think that's incredibly important. Accounting needs receipts, right? That's just a basic fact. And again, I think it's a useful exercise and it's important that we have these metrics. But are we going to use it as the nuts and bolts of regulations and disclosure? We need to get a bit further down the path there before we could say, yeah, that's the way forward. Whereas I think with the methodology that's being proposed under Scope 2 by Greenhouse Gas Protocol, that is something that is verifiable. And I think it's super important. That is something that is also shown to deliver in modeling exercises, is shown to be able to deliver long-term beneficial, consequential outcomes for emissions, incentives for new technologies. So yeah, it's not just about bean counting, right?
This is another problem with the bean counting around consequential accounting is on what time horizon, right? What changes have your actions inspired on what time horizon? This year? There are ripple effects 10 years down the line. Say if I invested in geothermal today, maybe I didn't produce X amount of clean power by next year, but I boosted the market a little bit. I made the next investment in geothermal easier. How do you measure all of that?
You don't measure it, you estimate. I think that's important.
Yeah.
You can't measure something that didn't happen. You can't measure that, but you can come up with hopefully pretty reasonable ways of estimating that. But I always have a bit of an issue with measure in this context, because measure is an electricity meter where you can like measure the output. And I think we are in different worlds when you talk about 10-year impacts.
So you both agree, though.
Yeah.
You both agree that the sort of inventory of Scope 2 reporting and consequential accounting should be kept distinct
100%
and clearly separate.
Yes.
And so then how do we envision that information being conveyed to shareholders and customers? Are we literally just talking about two separate badges, two separate levels, two separate certifications, like some sort of combined? I mean, I don't know if you guys have thought through down, all the implications of this, but like, how does that get reported, I guess? What does a company do with those two numbers?
I think you do have to really report them separately. And I think there needs to be kind of guidance on kind of stating that explicitly, because the entire point of separating them is that they are fundamentally different measures. One of them is much less certain and is trying to estimate explicit impact. The other one is not trying to estimate, is actually measuring the emissions embodied in the power you're consuming.
But the problem is, like, the former one is the one that everybody really, in their heart of hearts, cares about. Like, the fuzzy one is the one that, in the end, really matters the most.
Yeah. And I think that's the real challenge here, is that the thing that we care about the most is also the thing that is, again, like hardest to measure, and also like is most likely to be wrong. And so I think the reality is that the work of decarbonizing your physical supply is ultimately something that everyone is going to have to do if we're serious about decarbonizing. And progress toward that is a really, really important thing to report. And it's something that we can actually measure with very, very good accuracy.
This is a very important point. I think ultimately companies will always spend orders of magnitude more time and effort and money and capital on decarbonizing or working on physical power that they need to run their businesses. When you go to investment committee and ask for a 10-year contract for physical power, that is a different conversation to going in and saying, we're going to commit to this power that we can't actually use, right? Like, so I think the best way to actually have the best consequential long-term outcome of these systems is to have companies really focus on using clean power in their operations. That will have these knock-on trigger effects. They'll ultimately probably spend a lot more money on that. And so probably that's maybe the best we can do, right? Use this rigorous inventory system that will show who's using the most clean power, and probably likely in the long run will also have the best consequential outcome, right? So I think that I really think it's important to link these two things together and realize that probably in the long run, we can actually have the best consequential impact by having companies really focus on using clean power.
Yeah, and of course, like investing in these nascent or newer or less developed technologies for reasons that have been discussed a million times on this pod, ripples out, obviously affects the trajectory of developing countries, et cetera, in ways that, again, are very, very difficult
even to something not as
quantify
fancy, but like if you have an hourly target and you just do a small amount of demand response, but you're like a really large gigawatt scale data center, that can have huge cost impacts right now on how grids are built out, on how costs are socialized to ratepayers. And that's something that in today's accounting or alternative approaches is totally ignored. Like, you totally ignore that problem because you can just get a rec from another time. Obviously, with this more hourly granular approach.
Yes, just accelerating the development of the demand response market.
For me is enormous. It's really something that we it's not as cool as a new technology. It's maybe a bit simple and boring to talk about. I don't know, like what it is sometimes, but I think it's incredibly, incredibly important, and it can really have major cost and emissions benefits in the short run.
All right. Well, I think we did it, guys. I think we've figured out Rex. It only took 2 pods. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming on, walking through all this. It's super enormously clarifying, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all 3. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.